You ever had one of those shifts where you swear the universe is messing with you? That was my Thursday night. Rain hammering the windows, the overhead lights humming like they were auditioning for a horror movie soundtrack, and me, Claire, overworked, underpaid, and navigating the labyrinth of a dimly lit hospital. Some call it the graveyard shift. I call it prime time for weird stuff. The night started uneventfully enough. Patients were asleep, monitors were beeping their usual lullaby, and I was mentally cataloging my snack options for my next break. Then I passed room 306. Its door was slightly ajar, the faint glow of the emergency light spilling out. Nothing unusual, except the sign on the door read discharged. Now, in hospital lingo, discharged usually means the patient went home or, well, the other kind of discharged. But as I peeked inside, there was a man lying on the bed, staring at the ceiling like it owed him money. He was pale, motionless, and wearing one of those red wristbands we only use for, well, you know. At first, I thought it was a paperwork error. Happens all the time. A mix-up between rooms, maybe? So I stepped closer, squinting at the chart hanging by the bed. And that's when I froze. The chart didn't list his vitals or treatment plan. It listed a timestamp, deceased, 2:17 p.m. Okay, Claire, you've officially watched too many ghost stories, I muttered to myself. But I couldn't shake the unease crawling up my neck. Determined to prove my sanity, I walked into the room. Sir, you're not supposed to be here, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But he didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even breathe. And then, of course, he did. His head turned so fast I nearly dropped the clipboard. His eyes, glassy and unblinking, locked onto mine. Before I could back away, his hand shot out and grabbed my wrist. It was cold, not the I need a blanket kind of cold, but the this shouldn't exist kind of cold. He leaned closer, his grip tightening. Not yet, he whispered, his voice barely a breath but sharp enough to slice through my composure. Then, just as quickly, he was gone. Vanished. No puff of smoke, no dramatic sound cue. Just me, standing alone in an empty room, clutching a red wristband that wasn't mine. After that night, let's just say my career as a nurse got a whole lot more interesting. You'd think I'd have marched straight out of that hospital and never looked back, right? Nope. Bills don't pay themselves, and as much as I wanted to, I couldn't exactly explain phantom patient on a resignation letter. So, I stayed. Brilliant decision, Claire. Truly. I'd only been on the night shift for a couple of weeks. Everyone says it's an adjustment, but no one warns you about the vibe. It's like the hospital's personality changes after dark. The halls seem longer, the corners darker, and every little sound feels like it's meant just for you. I was still learning the ropes, trying to figure out the quirks of my coworkers and the unwritten rules of this place. For instance, the wristbands. You'd think marking deceased patients with red wristbands was a relic of a bygone era, but nope, it's standard practice here. It helps avoid confusion, my supervisor explained casually, as if that made it less creepy. Confusion for who exactly? The patients? I remember asking one of the older nurses, Linda, why we didn't just update the system. She shrugged, then leaned in with a smirk like she was about to spill some juicy gossip. You'll get used to it. Besides, it's tradition. Every hospital has its quirks. That's the kind of answer people give when they don't want to say, weird stuff happens, and we've just decided to live with it. Turns out, quirks was putting it lightly. Between rounds, I started hearing the stories. Not directly, of course. Everyone likes to pretend they're too busy for ghost tales. But I'd catch snippets in the break room or whispered exchanges in the supply closet. There was the patient who disappeared from a locked room, leaving only a single red wristband on the bed. The nurse who quit after claiming she saw someone she'd pronounced dead roaming the halls. And, of course, the classic ghost in the elevator story. The first time I worked the isolation wing, I thought, how bad could it be? It was bad. For starters, the silence wasn't the comforting kind. It was suffocating, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. A couple of patients there had weird behavior, and I swear they looked at me like they knew something I didn't. One guy, Mr. Powell, caught my eye during rounds. He was frail but alert. "You're new," he said, like it was a fact he'd been waiting to share. "You'll see soon enough." "See what?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. He just smiled, that faint, unsettling kind of smile that makes you want to change the subject. That unease started creeping into everything. Passing by empty rooms gave me chills, not because they were empty, but because they felt occupied. And the shadows? Let's just say I started questioning the wattage in every single bulb in that place. The worst part? My coworkers. They acted like all of this was completely normal. One night, I asked Diane, another nurse, if she'd ever had a patient grab her wrist and whisper cryptic nonsense before vanishing into thin air. Her reply: a dry laugh and a casual, "Oh, you'll get your share of stories, don't worry." That's the thing, though. I wasn't worried. I was waiting, because after what happened in room 306, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching. The night after my little introduction to ghost stories and cryptic patients, things went from weird but manageable to what even is reality anymore? It started with another red wristband. Of course it did. I was making my rounds, clipboard in hand, trying to focus on my tasks instead of the growing unease in my chest. Room 214. Patient, Mr. Greaves. He was new. Admitted earlier that day with chest pain. Nothing unusual. Or so I thought. When I opened the door, he was sitting upright in bed, his face pale and drawn, like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes snapped to mine as soon as I stepped in. For a second, I considered backing out and pretending I hadn't seen him. But no, I'm a professional. "Mr. Greaves," I said, forcing my voice to stay calm. "How are you feeling tonight?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he held up his wrist. That damn red band. "You have to help me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't belong here." Now, there's a lot of ways to interpret that sentence, and none of them are comforting. I tried to play it off, asking him about his symptoms, if he needed water, the usual routine. He just shook his head, gripping the edge of his blanket so tightly his knuckles turned white. "They made a mistake," he said. "I'm not supposed to be here. Not yet." My throat felt dry. "What do you mean by not yet?" He didn't answer. He just stared at me with those hollow eyes, and I swear the room got colder, not the kind of cold you can blame on a bad thermostat. This felt deliberate, like the air was pressing against my skin. I finished the checkup as quickly as I could and practically sprinted back to the nurse's station, clipboard clutched to my chest like it was some kind of shield. Diane was there, sipping coffee like she didn't have a care in the world. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual and definitely failing. "What's the deal with the red wristbands?" She looked up, her expression unreadable. "Why do you ask?" I don't know. They're unsettling." Diane chuckled, but it wasn't a warm laugh. It was the kind of laugh people use when they're trying to brush something off. "It's just tradition," she said. "You'll get used to it." "Yeah, you've mentioned that before. But seriously, do they mean something, like beyond the obvious?" For a moment, she didn't answer. She just stared into her coffee, her fingers drumming against the mug. Then she looked at me, and her smile was gone. "Claire, sometimes it's better not to ask questions you don't want answers to." That was the end of the conversation. She got up, tossed her cup into the trash, and walked away. Helpful, right? The rest of the night didn't get any better. The lights in the hallway started flickering. Monitors in empty rooms beeped and flashed like they were picking up non-existent heartbeats. I passed by room 214 again, and I swear I saw Mr. Greaves standing by the window, staring out into the darkness. When I stepped closer, he wasn't there. That night, I barely slept. And when I finally did, the dreams came. They started harmless enough. Random hospital scenes, mundane tasks. They were everywhere, crowding around me, their faces pale and hollow. Their hands clawed at my arms, my chest, my throat, pulling me down, suffocating me. I woke up drenched in sweat, gasping for air. My arms stung, and when I looked down, there were faint red marks circling my wrist, like I'd been wearing a band too tight. By the time my next shift rolled around, I was running on 3 hours of sleep and enough coffee to fuel a small city. But even that wasn't enough to shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something bigger than a few creepy stories or flickering lights. I thought about Diane's warning, about her refusal to answer my questions. And for the first time since I started at that hospital, I seriously considered quitting. But curiosity is a funny thing, isn't it? It keeps you asking questions, even when every instinct is screaming at you to stop. By the time I hit my next shift, I'd officially graduated from curious to obsessed. It wasn't just the red wristbands anymore. It was the way everything seemed tied to them. The flickering lights, the cryptic comments, the cold spots that made my breath fog up like I was wandering through a freezer aisle. Something was wrong with this place, and I was going to figure out what. Hospitals keep records for everything. That's one thing I've learned in this job. Admissions, discharges, treatments, deaths, all neatly documented and stored. So, when I found myself with a rare moment of quiet, I took a detour to the archives. The archives weren't exactly user-friendly. Imagine a basement lined with rows of mismatched filing cabinets, each one stuffed to the brim with papers that probably hadn't seen daylight in decades. It smelled like mildew and regret. I started digging, not really sure what I was looking for, but hoping something would jump out. And then it did. A folder tucked at the back of a drawer, labeled in shaky handwriting. Special cases. Restricted. Now, I know what you're thinking. Claire, leave it alone. Go back to your rounds and pretend you never saw it. But let's be honest, that was never going to happen. Inside were pages of typed notes, old photographs, and even a few newspaper clippings. The more I read, the more my stomach felt like it was tying itself in knots. Decades ago, this hospital had been the site of a government-funded experiment. The details were murky, something about testing early warning systems for critical patients. But the results? Absolute chaos. Patients started dying, not because they were sick, but because something was marking them. The experiment ended abruptly after a series of unexplainable incidents. No one involved ever spoke publicly about it, and the hospital quietly buried the entire affair. And then I found it. A memo dated 2 weeks after the experiment ended. It wasn't a long note, just a few sentences scrawled in uneven handwriting. The wristbands are not for the dead. They are for those next in line. The mark chooses. Once given, it cannot be undone. I closed the folder, my hands shaking. My mind was racing. There it is again, Claire, jumping to conclusions. Maybe it was a prank someone pulled decades ago, but deep down, I knew better. Suddenly, the room felt suffocating, like the air had thickened around me. My vision blurred, the edges of the room swimming like heat waves on asphalt. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake the sensation, and that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. But as I held my arm out, the faint outline of a red band began forming around my wrist, like someone was drawing it in with invisible ink. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "No, no, no." But it didn't go away. It just sat there, mocking me, as if to say, "Welcome to the club." I'd like to say I handled the discovery of that red mark with grace and composure, but the truth? I panicked. Full-on, heart-pounding, sweaty palms panic. I tried scrubbing it off like it was marker ink, even though I knew that wasn't going to work. The mark wasn't on my skin. It was in it, like it belonged there. That was the longest shift of my life. Every sound, every shadow seemed amplified. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting, just out of sight. And when I finally got off work and stepped outside, things only got worse. I was walking to my car, clutching my bag like it was a life preserver, when I saw her. A woman leaning against a lamppost, scrolling through her phone. She looked normal enough, except for one detail: a bright red band around her wrist. I froze, staring. She didn't notice me. She just kept scrolling, oblivious to the way my stomach had dropped to my knees. The drive home was a blur, and by the time I stumbled through my front door, I was convinced I'd lost it completely. But then, as I was texting my sister to distract myself, I saw it again. Her picture in my contacts. There she was, smiling with her 2 kids, and on her wrist, a red band. It was faint, almost unnoticeable unless you were looking for it, but it was there. "Claire," I muttered to myself, pacing the kitchen. "You're sleep-deprived. You're imagining things. You need a nap, a drink, maybe a vacation. Definitely a vacation." But denial only goes so far. The next night at work, I decided to test my theory. There was a patient in room 108, a man in his 60s recovering from surgery. His vitals were stable, and there was no reason to think he wouldn't make it, except for the red band. I told myself it was a coincidence, just an odd hospital policy blown out of proportion. But I had to know. So, during rounds, I waited until the hallway was empty, slipped into his room, and gently tugged the band off his wrist. He woke up screaming. Not a startled scream, a horrified scream like he was seeing something I couldn't. The monitors blared, his heart rate spiking off the charts. I tried to calm him down, but it was no use. He clutched his chest, gasping for air, and within seconds, it was over. Code blue. The room flooded with nurses and doctors, but it was too late. I stumbled out of the room, my hands shaking, the wristband still clutched in my fist. Whatever I'd just done, it felt wrong, not like a mistake, more like breaking a rule I hadn't known existed. Diane found me in the supply closet later, staring at the red band as if it might bite me. She didn't even ask what had happened. She just shut the door and sat down across from me, her expression grim. "You tried to take it off, didn't you?" she asked. I nodded. Her shoulders sagged, and for the first time, she looked tired. Not just the usual overworked nurse tired, but the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying a secret too heavy for too long. "You don't get it," she said, her voice low. "The wristbands, they aren't just markers, they're warnings. You can't cheat them. If you try, it backfires. Every time." "Warnings for what?" I asked, my voice cracking. "For who's next?" she said simply. "The hospital's been like this for decades. It started with an experiment. But whatever they did, it left something behind. And now, the bands, they know." I wanted to argue, to tell her she was being ridiculous, but the look in her eyes stopped me. This wasn't a joke to her. "Why didn't you warn me?" I demanded. "Because no one warned me," she said. "And because if anyone finds out you know, they'll come for you too." That was comforting. Really. From then on, things spiraled. The figures started appearing, not fully formed, but shadows at the edges of my vision. I'd catch glimpses of them in reflective surfaces, standing too close or reaching toward me. They didn't seem to like it when I tried to break the rules. And every time I thought I was alone, I wasn't. If I turned a corner too quickly or glanced into a darkened hallway, they'd be there, just out of reach but impossible to ignore. They weren't human. They didn't even try to pretend. It got to the point where I stopped asking questions, stopped trying to figure out the rules. On patients, on coworkers, on strangers at the grocery store, even on my own wrist, which was growing brighter by the day. But ignoring it didn't help. The shadows multiplied. The wristbands felt like they were everywhere. And every time I thought it couldn't get worse, I'd remember Diane's words. They know. Blackouts in a hospital are the stuff of nightmares. Monitors cut out, emergency lights flicker half-heartedly, and the air becomes thick with a kind of pressure you can't shake. For us night shift warriors, it's just another thing to deal with. At least, that's what I told myself when the power went out halfway through my shift. At first, I thought it was routine. The generator sputtered to life, casting the hallways in that eerie orange glow that makes everyone look like a wax figure. But as I stepped into the corridor, I realized something wasn't right. The halls weren't empty. Patients, people who should have been bedridden, were standing. Some leaned against walls. Others stared into the distance, their faces blank, their wrists adorned with unmistakable red bands. And it wasn't just the patients. I recognized my coworkers among them. Diane was there, her eyes glassy, her head tilted as if she were listening to something I couldn't hear. Even the janitor, the guy who always hummed off-key pop songs while mopping, was there, his mop abandoned on the floor. I wanted to yell, to demand what was going on, but my voice caught in my throat. My instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt anchored in place. Then, the temperature dropped. Not a subtle shift, but a biting cold that made my breath cloud in front of me. And that's when I saw it. A figure emerged from the far end of the hallway, moving with a slow, deliberate purpose. It wasn't fully formed, more like a ripple in the air, a shadow that refused to stay still. But its presence was suffocating. "You've been busy," it said, its voice like wind through a broken window. It didn't have a face, but I could feel it watching me. The kind of watching that sees straight through your skin and into the parts of yourself you'd rather keep hidden. "What? What do you want?" I managed to croak. It tilted its head, and I swear I heard laughter. Low, distant, like it was coming from everywhere at once. "You already know." It gestured toward my wrist, and there it was. The red band, glowing brighter than ever. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. I'm not like them." It stepped closer, and the air seemed to crackle with energy. Everyone says that. At first. Desperation makes you do stupid things. Mine? Bolting for the archives. If the curse was tied to the wristbands, and the wristbands were tied to the hospital's records, then destroying those records might. It wasn't a good plan, but it was the only one I had. The archive room was colder than the hallway, the frost creeping up the edges of the metal cabinets. My hands shook as I tore open drawers, yanking out files and scattering papers. "You think this will stop it?" The voice was behind me now, far too close. I turned, and the figure was there, leaning against the doorframe like it had all the time in the world. "The wristbands aren't paper," it said. "They're destiny." I grabbed a lighter from my pocket. Don't ask why I had one. Let's just say night shifts have their moments, and set the corner of a folder on fire. The flames caught quickly, devouring the brittle pages like they'd been waiting for it. The figure didn't flinch. "This won't save you," it said, "but it's fun to watch you try." The fire spread faster than I anticipated, licking up the walls and filling the room with thick, acrid smoke. I stumbled backward, coughing, my eyes watering as the figure stepped closer. "You were marked the moment you stepped into this place," it said. "There's no running from it, no hiding. You're ours." Its hand, if you could call it that, reached out, its shape shifting and warping like smoke in a windstorm. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. The fire was spreading, the heat pressing against my back as I barreled down the hallway. The figures were still there, lining the walls, watching me with those empty, unblinking eyes. I don't remember how I made it to the exit. 1 second, I was sprinting through a maze of orange light and shadows, and the next, I was outside, gulping in the cold night air. The hospital loomed behind me, its windows glowing faintly as if the building itself were alive. I wanted to believe I was safe, that I'd escaped, but then my phone buzzed. A message from my sister. "Hey, are you okay?" Weird question, but have you ever noticed this faint red line on my wrist? The curse wasn't confined to the hospital. It had followed me, and now it was spreading. I'd like to tell you that I immediately got my act together after that night, marched into some investigator's office, and blew the lid off the whole wristband conspiracy. But the truth is, I did what most people would do. I ran. The very next morning, I handed in my resignation. No 2-week notice, no heartfelt goodbye speech, just a scribbled note left on Diane's desk and a vow to never set foot in that hospital again. I was out the door before anyone could ask questions, my head pounding with a mix of fear and guilt. The problem with running, though, is that it doesn't fix anything. It just gives your nightmares a new address. At first, I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it all. Stress does weird things to your brain, right? Maybe I was overworked, sleep deprived. Maybe I'd misunderstood what I saw. But denial only works until reality smacks you in the face. And smack me, it did. It started small. A woman at the grocery store with a red band peeking out from under her sleeve. A delivery driver with one barely visible as he handed me a package. Little things I could brush off. Until I couldn't. My family wasn't safe either. My sister called one night, casual as you please, asking if I'd ever noticed a faint red mark on her wrist. My heart dropped to my stomach. I told her it was probably just a rash and hung up before my voice could betray me. But the worst part? My own wrist. The mark wasn't just faint anymore. It had deepened, the red bleeding into my skin like ink on wet paper. Some mornings, I'd wake up and swear it was brighter than the day before, like it was counting down to something I didn't want to know about. I tried ignoring it. I wore long sleeves, avoided reflective surfaces, and deleted every photo where my wrist might show. But the mark wasn't interested in being ignored. The whispers started a few weeks later. At first they were faint, almost like a breeze brushing past my ear. I'd hear my name when no one was around, or a low hum just loud enough to make me glance over my shoulder. But they grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like they were coming from inside my own head. "It's time," they'd say, over and over, until I couldn't drown them out no matter how loud I turned up the TV. I stopped going out. What was the point? The wristbands were everywhere, on strangers at the park, on the barista handing me coffee, even on the cashier at the gas station, who gave me a look like she knew exactly what was happening. The final straw came one night, when I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying not to think about how bright the mark on my wrist had gotten. The air felt heavier than usual, pressing down on my chest, and then I heard it. A voice, clear as day, right beside me. It's time. I shot upright, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was empty, of course it was, but the voice didn't stop. It's time, Claire. The mark on my wrist began to burn, the heat searing through my skin as if it were alive. I clutched it, trying to make it stop, but the more I fought, the brighter it grew. And then I heard it, the sound that still haunts me, a flat line. Not from a machine, but somewhere deep, like it was resonating through my very bones. I don't remember much after that, just darkness. Maybe I passed out. Maybe something else happened. All I know is, when I woke up, the mark was gone. My wrist was clear, unmarked, like it had never been there in the first place. But I wasn't relieved, not even close. Because as I looked around my dimly lit apartment, I saw them. Shadows in the corners, standing just out of reach, watching. I don't think I escaped. I think they're waiting, biding their time. And when my wrist starts glowing again, I'll know.